Tá bom, então, bom dia a todos. Depois de nós tentarmos diversas maneiras e alguns problemas de conexão, então gostaria de, em nome do Programa de Pós Graduação em Ciência dos Alimentos, agradecer todos os presentes que estão assistindo no nosso link do YouTube. E nós vamos ter a palestra com o professor Timo, que é o professor lá da Universidade de Bonn, que está sendo o professor colaborador do professor Christian Hoffmann, do nosso programa também de pós-graduação. Então, first of all, I would like to thank Timo. And Christian, could you please make the introduction, please?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great pleasure actually to introduce Timo. We have started collaborating loosely several years ago now with coming to Brazil of the One Health graduate program. Is actually, I'm sure Timo will talk a little bit about that. Timo is a senior researcher at the Center for Development Research at the University of Bonn. And the graduate program is a joint effort between three institutions in the region: University of Bonn, University of Applied Sciences, Bonn Rhein-Sieg, and the United Nations University, all in the area. And Timo actually works in this nexus of food and in the context of One Health, all the way from irrigation and transmissions of AMR throughout the food chain, and those interests synergize very nicely with some of the interests that we have in my lab with antimicrobial resistance within the gut microbiome and potential pathways of transmission of that. So it's a really great pleasure to actually host Timo on this talk. This entire story this year actually happened very, very different than what we had in mind, because, you know, everything happened differently this year. But I actually received a small fellowship to go visit the University of Bonn and consolidate this collaboration, which we are now in the process of analyzing documentation with the School of Pharmaceutical Sciences. So the idea is to actively exchange students and strengthen in several ways the interaction between the two programs. And I think that we have a lot to gain from working together. So Timo, it's a pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind introduction. And yeah, it is a pleasure, of course, to have the opportunity to speak. I would have much preferred the original plan of this being a physical talk in Sao Paulo. I think we would have all enjoyed that. Yeah, but I think this will have to make do, and I'm quite hopeful that next year there is going to be opportunities again to travel, and maybe there can be some opportunities to do a physical talk also. Yeah, as Chris has already said, we have the One Health Graduate School, and we actually just recently received our positive funding decision for the second round. So we are going to continue with another 12 students, and two or three of those are going to be working explicitly in Sao Paulo also. And I actually didn't include the slides today on the kind of background of our graduate school, because I really wanted to focus the attention on the topic here. As you can see on the slide, the One Health approach to antimicrobial resistance, and with a particular focus on the food system interactions. And I am assuming that most of you who are going to be listening, this is not going to be completely new. This is, to be honest, it's not groundbreaking information that I'm going to be presenting today, but it's more of a view from One Health onto this topic of antimicrobial resistance. And as the subtitle kind of suggests, the food system interactions that we have, of course, are an important part of One Health. So what am I going to talk about today? Here I just have a brief outline. I want to talk a little bit about the origins of One Health, because I think this is something that might not be as well understood. What actually is One Health? Where does it come from? Then go a little bit into the problem of antimicrobial resistance, and highlight why is actually One Health a good approach to tackle antimicrobial resistance. Then I'm going to look a little bit into some of the, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, to be honest, a little bit of the history of antimicrobial use in agriculture. So this is already explaining why One Health is so important for antimicrobial resistance. And lastly, the spread through the food chain. And I hope that in the end, we're going to have some time also to discuss and for you to ask some questions. So One Health, what actually is One Health? And we do have this quite nice definition, and it's not quite agreed upon what actually One Health is, but this definition from the One Health Commission is becoming increasingly popular. And this is also the one that we identified as being the one that is being most commonly cited in the literature. So One Health is a collaborative effort of multiple health science professions together with their related disciplines and institutions, working locally, nationally, and globally to attain optimal health for people, domestic animals, wildlife, plants, and our environment. Wow, this is really like an amazing concept, and it's very holistic, very all-encompassing. One important thing that comes that pops out is it's very much about collaboration. This interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary work is very at the heart of One Health. And to be honest, this is also what our graduate school is very much pursuing. We try to find multiple disciplines and work collaboratively across those disciplines. So this is not something that we can do solely from public health, or solely from food science, or solely from veterinary science, solely from agricultural science, sociology, political science. We need to come together and work jointly on this. The origin of One Health actually lies in veterinary medicine. And they explored those linkages already quite long ago. And this is where the One Health concept actually comes from. And today in our, the big challenges that we have in the 21st century, we do need integrated interdisciplinary perspective of health. And this is something that has become much more accepted. And particularly now, in light of this current pandemic, it is really shown that health is something that is very fundamental to the working of our global economy. And the challenges cannot be solved just by public health, just by human medicine, but it is actually something that requires lots of different sectors to work together. So we need to look integratively and interdisciplinary to actually find solutions. In the context of the current outbreak, it is quite clear that it's not just a problem of lacking surveillance, no, but it's a question of the global economy and how it's connected. It's about the food system. It's about wildlife trade. It's about ecological changes. And all of those different disciplines need to come together to find solutions that can actually tackle these complex problems. But getting back to One Health and the origins of One Health. Traditionally, I see there's 3 points of intersections. And now, as you can see here in the comparative anatomy, 1728 to 1793, the lifespan of John Hunter, who invented or is the father of comparative anatomy. Where it starts is actually using animals to understand human anatomy and physiology. This is one point of intersection where we can see humans and animals are not that different, because traditionally we used animals to understand the human body as well. The next part is then animals studied in comparison to humans. And this is something on the one hand side, when we're looking at something like germ theory, the understanding that there is these microbes, there is these germs that are causing diseases. And it's the same agents, the same pathogens that can infect humans and animals. This then leads to the ideas of vaccine development. And I think you all know that quite commonly, especially in the traditional sense, vaccines were essentially brought from animals, and they, like for the cowpox, for example, was then used to be a vaccine against smallpox in humans. So humans and animals share a lot of things, and this is how the origin of One Health really comes along. Understanding that there is actually no dividing lines between humans and animals, that we have these zoonotic diseases that are the pathogens that cross the species boundaries. And Virchow, who is one of the godfathers of One Health, quite clearly understood that if you study the life cycle of pathogens, if you study the spread and the transmission mediums, that very often humans and animals are part of the life cycles of certain pathogens, particularly in terms of parasites and so on. Yeah, and one of the key quotes here, that animal pathology is actually a necessary foundation of all medicine. Or in different words, there is no dividing line between animal health and human health. Yeah, but then what happened? Actually, we saw as the disciplines developed and we grew more and more specialized, not just in medicine, but across all sectors, really, that there was an increasing segregation of veterinary and human medicine, where initially it was much closer together. Now we have different government departments, different funding streams, different research and educational institutions, different international institutions that govern the veterinary, the animal side, and the human medicine side. And then there was Calvin Schwabe, who actually started to renew the interest in human and animal interactions. He called it one medicine. He coined that term, and actually saying that there is no veterinary and human medicines. These are two strands that are interwoven and should actually be understood as one whole. When we see that animal health is actually a crucial problem of human health and development. Now it's framed negatively, but in a way, if we protect animal health, indirectly, we are also protecting human health. And then lastly, of course, the emergence and re-emergence of infectious diseases are very much linked to zoonotics. 3/4 of the re-emerging diseases are zoonotic diseases. These are the main problems of the 21st century. Yeah, so then since the turn of the millennium, there was an increasing acceptance that this One Health view is actually something that is quite important. There's a recognition that the health risk can cross borders and species barriers, so we need to look at it integratively. It is clear that we need more integrated interventions, that we need more intersectoral and interdisciplinary work. That we need to move from this idea of one medicine, one world, to actually one health. And maybe in the distant future, we can also see something like one welfare emerging. Essentially, we have these connected concepts, and there's an increasing blurring between them. We can also throw in eco-health, planetary health, all of these concepts, and there are, of course, distinctions in between them. But currently, it appears that the One Health concept is the one that's gaining most political traction and is actually being implemented across the world. Yeah, so as I said, it is recognized as actually a very important perspective and approach to tackle these health problems. And why is there so much recognition? And this is basically coming from the big three, the WHO, the FAO, and the OIE, who signed the tripartite agreement. And with that, they basically said, we need One Health. We need to act together. WHO from the human health side, OIE from the animal health side, and the FAO from the agricultural food side. Only if we combine the institutional powers of these different disciplines, only then are we going to be able to find effective and efficient solutions. In order to understand this full range of benefits that we can seek from implementing One Health, we do need to look at humans, animals, and the environment in connection to each other. And only then we can start to see the added value of One Health by tackling these issues from an intersectoral way. And this is really where the knowledge gap is at the moment. And this is also where we in the One Health Graduate School in Bonn are kind of working towards. Looking at different issues, trying to understand the interactions between humans, animals, and environment. And agriculture there is a very important nexus. So the food system is one of our foci areas. In the end, One Health is a problem-solving concept. So we're always trying to actually solve a problem. One Health is not basic research, it's applied research. And in a way, it is an iterative process because it's about using the evidence to create interventions, implementing the interventions and then evaluating, and then going back to the drawing board, back to the evidence to improve the effectiveness of such interventions. So One Health is an iterative process that's going to take a long time to actually create the vision of what One Health might be. So what does One Health encompass? it's huge. It's a huge topic. Human, animal, environment. So what I like to show is the One Health umbrella. And so in the One Health umbrella, we can see that there's various different topic ideas and spheres. On the right-hand side, we have this comparative medicine sphere, which is more the, as I call it, the more traditional way of One Health, looking at human-animal bonds, looking at relationships, similarities, and differences between humans and animals. And then we, on the other hand side, on the left side, the zoonotic infections, where most of the focus is lying. So we have these infectious diseases, of course, the zoonotic, the vector-borne, the emerging, re-emerging diseases. We have the view of the health system as a whole, in terms of surveillance, in terms of antimicrobial resistance, development, in terms of treatment and prevention. A focus on water systems as an important transmission medium, and of course, environmental health as their own right, the idea of eco-health, what actually is a healthy environment, how do we measure a healthy environment? And then also in terms of then the exposure of environmental hazards to humans and animals and the effects that has. And lastly, the food system, which the agricultural practices, but primarily the livestock keeping, are important elements in terms of infectious diseases, but also in terms of environmental pollution. And then, of course, food safety, which is much more about the spread of such agents throughout the food system. And what we can see in these categories here, these are definitely not mutually exclusive. They're very much integrated to each other. So there's a huge amount of themes and topics that can be extracted. And what we want to focus on today is antimicrobial resistance in the context of food systems. But before we get there, a One Health framework. How do we actually understand this concept of One Health? And this is what we usually find in the literature. We have these three spheres, and there are some intersections, a couple of topics as a cloud around that. We also find this type of diagram where there is an added sphere or basic component in terms of food safety added. So there is more focus on agriculture and there also on the food system. That already gets us a little bit closer to the topic that we want to talk about today. In our graduate school, we actually try to understand what lies at the center of these three spheres. So in our framework here, we developed the idea that the environment is actually at the center, the biophysical environment. This is one of the things that we divided. When we're talking about environment, what do we mean? Very commonly, we're talking about the biophysical environment, but part of that, of course, of the environment is also the socio-political environment. And the socio-political environment in terms of like the culture, the governance system, the behaviors of the humans, those are impacting our biophysical environment. And at the same time, our biophysical environment is also shaping the way we are behaving and the way policies are being formed. So it's kind of like an inward-outward interaction. And on the outside of this, we're having some of the stressors that are coming from the different spheres. So from the animal side, we have things like the industrialization of agriculture that is changing the way we are interacting with our livestock. But it's also in terms of like natural resource extraction and how we are destroying the natural habitats of wildlife. And we have from the bottom, from the ecosystem, having land use changes, having extreme weather events, and of course from the human side coming in something like population growth and things like that. So all of those things are interacting with each other and are shaping the way that health basically is produced. And we see that the environment there is a very important driver. So, I mean, this is just to kind of give some idea about how do we understand One Health. And I think the important part is that One Health is not really a research topic as such, but it's more a way of looking at research topics. It's about looking at it interdisciplinary and always understanding the interaction between humans, animals, and the environment in shaping the health problem that is going to be the actual research objective or research question, research subject of any research that comes from a One Health perspective. So in this case today, we want to look at antimicrobial resistance. And I'm sure that most of you will know this, and I will just go through it briefly for the completeness of it. So that antimicrobial resistance is actually something that is quite natural. The development of resistance to antimicrobials occurred since the antimicrobials were first introduced. It's simple selective pressure. However, the rate of this resistance development, of course, has a correlation with the use of it. So as we are seeing that there is an excessive use of antimicrobials, we're also increasing the selective pressure, and that's why there is a more rapid development of resistance. We're also seeing that there is more and more multi-drug resistance because more commonly the new classes or reserve last resort antibiotics are being used, and of course then resistances are also developing to those. When we're looking at the past, resistant pathogens, even though they were around for a long time, they were usually associated with hospital settings or care settings, care facilities, elderly care facilities, and so on. But today we see that antimicrobial resistance is very widespread. We find them around the globe everywhere. We find them in surface waters, we find them in soils, we find them in our foods. So we do see that antimicrobial resistance is spreading around the globe, and it is part of our environment already. So are we entering a post-antibiotic era? And I'm sure that many of you have heard this term before, post-antibiotic era, the time after antibiotics are actually useful. Why are we talking about this? Primarily, no new big classes of antibiotics were discovered since the 1980s. And this is what we here see in the graphic as the so-called discovery void. So there's nothing really groundbreaking new coming. The kind of low-hanging fruits in terms of antibiotics, they were already discovered in the 40s and 50s. And you can see that on this timeline, that there is a clustering of antibiotics. These are like the smaller dots next to the bigger classes that were discovered in the 1940s through the 1950s and kind of like in the early 1960s. And after that, there's a reduction actually in new things coming out. And this is kind of linked also to less investment. There's less public investment, less industry investment. At the end of the 20th century, there was this idea that, oh, this problem of infectious diseases, this is solved. We got it under control. So there's not so much interest in actually investing from the public side. From the industry side, there is the problem that there is low profit margins. And this is mostly because if today, let's say, some pharmaceutical company would invent a new antibiotic, that antibiotic would essentially not be used. It would be called a reserve antibiotic, and it would be shelved and only used in the most severe multi-drug resistant cases, which means for the company, they're not going to sell. They're not going to sell a lot of that. And by the time that drug, that new antibiotic might be used more commonly, their patent might have run out, and there would be a new a different company that produce it more cheaply. So what we actually need is we need to have developed new funding mechanisms, new incentive structures for the pharmaceutical industry to actually keep on working on antibiotics, because there is going to be chances of creating new ways to tackle microbials. So entering the post-antibiotic era, we're certainly on the right path to that. So we have already a steep increase in multi-resistant pathogens. And here just a number from O'Neill. Between 2000 and 2010, the use of these so-called last resort antibiotic classes increased by 40%. Well, what does that actually mean for health and healthcare? Now, when we think about antibiotics, when are they being used? Most commonly, we see antibiotics for treating infectious diseases. And of course, that is a common use, but antibiotics have far more use than just infectious diseases. They're used, for example, in organ transplants. They're used for chemotherapies. In most surgeries, antibiotics are given. Ventilation patients require it, even in maternal care. So if we imagine, if we don't have working antibiotics anymore, things like a heart transplant would be close to impossible to achieve, because the risk of infection is so high. There is the need to preventively give antibiotics. So if essentially when we are losing our antibiotics, if we're going to have lower efficacy of antibiotics, we are going to increase the risk of many medical treatments. We are going to undermine the medical advances that have occurred basically over the last 100 years. And from the same publication, there is this graphic, and I'm sure many of you have seen it, and it has been criticized a lot because this number might have been a little bit of an over-exaggeration. But anyhow, I think the trend that it shows is quite clear. Already now, and this is basically in 2015, there's already 700,000 people, additional people dying because of antimicrobial resistance. And what is being projected here is that that number is going to rise to 10 million people in 2050 if the trends continue as they are. And what this is basically trying to illustrate is that AMR, antimicrobial resistance, is an urgent issue. It's going to be the #1 killer if we don't act, if we don't do something about it. So from what I've been saying now, it appears like, okay, this is a medical problem. Right? I mean, this is antibiotics. They're being used mostly for humans in various situations. So why do we study this from a One Health perspective? Well, as you probably already know, antibiotics are obviously not just used in humans, but they're also used in animals. And interestingly enough, most of the antibiotic classes that are used in animals are the same ones that we use in humans. In the United States, 31 out of 41 antibiotics used in animals are deemed medically important for humans. And then if we're looking, 70% of the antibiotic use in the United States is actually for animals. So it's actually not the human use that is the highest, but it's actually the animal use. And that is then becoming a quite interesting One Health issue, because we're seeing that we need to work together between veterinary and human medicine in order to really solve this issue. But it's not just human and veterinary medicine, because antibiotics are not fully metabolized in the body. The active compounds are released via our urine as well as our feces into wastewater or slurry. So that is then releasing antibiotics. Let's say, first of all, antibiotic kind of compounds, residues, released into the environment. So this is creating, on the one hand, selective pressure in the water environment. So there's going to be an acceleration of resistance development. As a kind of side note, a study that we done here in Bonn, it's the so-called Eureka project. They actually identified that the water treatment, the sewage treatment system, can actually be a kind of hotspot of resistance development. So although in the sewage treatment plant, the amount of bacteria or the amount of pathogens gets reduced significantly by the treatment process, the ones that do come out at the end of it, they have a higher tendency to be multi-drug resistance, because there is also the horizontal gene transfer. So the transfer of resistant genes between bacteria, between pathogens. And lastly, then the vertical gene transfer is that then the pathogen also passes it on to its subsequent generations. So we can see here that the environment, of course, also plays a role, because a lot of the antibiotic residues are actually going to be released into the environment. And it's not just the antibiotic compounds, the residues, but it's also then the resistant pathogens themselves, as well as then the resistant genes that can then be spread via the food chain. So another framework that we have used in our graduate school for the antibiotic resistance cluster is the one here. What we can see is we have here in the kind of maroon color our human side. So we have use of antibiotics, the AMU, antimicrobial use. That's the kind of yellow, orangish, beige color. In the clinical setting as well as in the community setting. Then we have our environment. So we have our water, our wastewater, our surface water, our soil, our plants. And then lastly, we also have our animals, our livestock production. And of course, all the humans as well as the livestock, they are releasing antimicrobials, either as in terms of residues or even in terms of resistant bacteria through the urine, through the feces, into the water environment. Through the water environment, it can reach the plants, and through the plants, it can then either through animal feed or also through human food can be passed back to the populations. Lastly, there's also antimicrobial use in plants itself, but I'll get to that in a moment. So all of this essentially then is One Health. So antimicrobial use in food production. And now we're going a little bit into the historical view. So as we are industrializing animal production, because there is an increasing demand for meat, one of the common ways is to intensify agricultural or livestock production in this case. So we increase the intensity, so higher density of animals, lower sanitary standards because they are more closer together. And this is being compensated then by antibiotic use. Primarily here, first of all, prophylactic treatment. The growth promotion was something that was then discovered as a kind of side effect. But even in the 1940s, there was already some concerns about residues of antimicrobials on meat and animal products. But the cheap and reliable meat supply was prioritized by the governments at the time. There was some regulation, but it was very fragmented. Some countries choose to restrict agricultural use in terms of spraying plants. Others banned certain types of classes, certain antibiotics for animal products. Others focused on surveillance of antimicrobial residues in animal products, but there was nothing uniform. Yeah, and as I was saying before, it was as a side effect kind of from the prophylactic treatment noted that low doses of antibiotics actually resulted in increased weight gains. And this was then kind of a spark of the use of growth promotion. So antibiotic growth promoters, HEPs, became very widely used across the world. And just as an example here, West Germany in the 50s and 60s, they used about 80% of the pigs and calves were being fed antibiotics for growth promotion. So, but then it's not just this non-therapeutic use in animals, but there was also the use in agriculture from the mid-1950s onwards. So there was, for example, plant sprays, antibiotics being sprayed onto fruit trees, and also antibiotics that were applied to rice fields in Japan. In the 1970s, we saw that in the US there was a surplus production of grains as well as antibiotics. So they saw a very great market in exporting these antibiotic laced feeds to Africa, South America, Southeast Asia. And with that, it basically spread the use of antimicrobials for growth promotion, for prophylaxis across the world. And I think this is a very disturbing number, looking at the growth in the agricultural sector. So the non-medical antibiotic use in the United States increased 30-fold between 1951 and 1970. It became common practice. And there was some concerns, as I mentioned before, from the public in terms of residues and so on. But that didn't actually stop the expansion at all. So between 1970 and 1978, this non-medical antibiotic use doubled again. In the European countries, then there was starting to be some bans in the AGPs, but there wasn't much meaningful effect at first. There was still an annual growth of 8%. There was an increased gray and black market. And in the context of Brazil, this is no different. So between 1968 and 1998, chicken production increased by 20-fold. And by 2010, 90% of the Brazilian poultry is actually produced in confined settings. And Brazil is actually using 9% of the global agricultural antibiotic use. So it is a big effect that we have in Brazil also. Yeah. Now, kind of coming to the end of this section, how did we reach to actually not using growth promotion anymore? And that is a great success that has been achieved. In 1993, actually, it was noted that there was VRE, so vancomycin resistant enterococcus in pigs and poultry from Denmark, Germany, and Britain. And that was interesting because this was a reserve antibiotic that was used very conservatively in humans. But it was also a similar one that was being used in growth promotion. And that was when we first, or when the people of the politicians first really realized that there was a very close linkage between the agricultural antibiotic use and the resistant development for humans. And this then led to the banning of these substances, 1995, 1996, and 1997. It's quite surprising to think that it's actually quite late that this was being done. The BSE in Britain, the mad cow disease, this kind of helped accelerate the banning of these antimicrobials. So by 2006, basically the most growth promoters were being banned inside Europe, and by 2010 this was initiated across the globe. In the context of Brazil, follows a very similar time frame. So starting from 2006, the normative instruction 65 basically started to restrict the agricultural growth promotion, antibiotic growth promotion. And there was more specific guidelines about prevention, hygiene standards inside stables, and so on. Between 1998 and 2019 in Brazil, 25 molecules, antibiotic molecules, were prohibited. So this was the focus on the ones that are of human medical importance. And so Brazil was actually one of the early countries to restrict it, but one thing that needs to be kept in mind is that there is not so much information available in terms of therapeutic and prophylactic use. And this is one of the concerns, that banning this growth promotion actually leads to farmers adapting to ways of actually treating animals more frequently, so that the net use of antibiotics is not that significantly reduced. So how does it spread through the food chain? So I think there is quite clearly there's a direct route and an indirect route. We have the direct route, which is mostly interesting in terms of occupational groups. So the veterinarians, the farmers, people working in the abattoir, the food handlers. And this is the kind of direct exposure with the animal, with the blood, with the urine, the feces, milk, saliva, semen, and so on. And in this regard, generally, the population level risk is considered quite low. However, there is an increasing understanding that these people, these occupational groups, of course, have lives outside of their occupation. So they're going out into their communities, into their families, and potentially spreading the resistant pathogens, resistant genes through the community. On the other hand, we have this indirect transmission, and this is much more in regard to the food chain, where we have animal products, meat, eggs, milk, dairy products, that have the potential of having antimicrobial residues on them, as well as also having the potential, of course, to carry resistant bacteria themselves or pathogens in general. And there we have a much higher exposure for the general population. So there's a lot bigger effect in terms of the consequences. However, when we're looking at the resistant pathogens, it is actually an issue of food safety. And in regard to food safety, we already have well-developed systems in place. And these are actually no different from if it's a resistant pathogen or a non-resistant pathogen. In the end, the food safety system can operate the same way. Resistant genes are much less controlled. So we do have a good system for residues. There is a good system in terms of pathogens, and then it's regardless if they're resistant or not. But resistant genes that might be on the food products is not so much controlled at the moment. Yeah, but it's not just animal products that can spread these antibiotic resistance and the antibiotic genes. And this is where this is becoming a much more integrated One Health idea. Well, we have the farm soils, manure, wastewater. These are all important reservoirs of resistance. So as I explained earlier, we have the release of antimicrobial residues, active compounds through the urine, through the feces. They enter the wastewater system. They enter the manure, the slurry, which can then or is applied to agricultural fields. And there we are basically creating or we're changing the way the native soil bacteria are working. So we are creating selective pressure. So there's a development of resistance. We are changing the microbial soil environment. Exactly how much sorption, how much fixing of antimicrobials is in the soil, of course, depends on the soil type, on the soil composition, the pH, and all of those things, and also on the different types of antibiotics. But generally, we can say that antibiotics do bioaccumulate in the soil. Once they are absorbed into the soil, they can move in the soil. And through this, they can reach to groundwater. They could be washed into surface water, or they can be taken up by plants. And with that, we are basically creating a circle of antibiotic residues, antimicrobial resistance being spread through the environment, and essentially then entering our food chain, and as such entering the human body in the last instance. And there's some studies. There's some studies that show that anaerobic fermentation and composting can actually remove the majority, about 99% of the administered antibiotics in case of animal manure. So there is ways to do it. But right now, one of the key challenges that we're having is that there is lacking knowledge, lacking awareness among many people. Yeah, so as I said before, in terms of the transmission, the pathways and mechanisms are the same for resistant pathogens compared to normal pathogens. So the control mechanisms follow also the same system, the food safety via hygiene and surveillance. However, we do have quite important knowledge gaps that still exist when it comes to the resistant genes. The soil resistome, for example, how does it interact with the resistance profile on the crops? What soil type is very absorbs a lot? Which soil types might be more difficult? What crops absorb more antibiotics, and what crops, where do they store it? Is it actually in the edible part of the crop, or is it maybe in the leaves that are not being eaten? So those are some of the questions that are still out there. And also in terms of the gene transfer, humans to humans via the animal products. As a last point, I also want to bring in aquaculture, which is another very important hotspot for resistant development. And that is mostly because antibiotics that are being applied to aquaculture systems, 70 to 80% of those antibiotics are basically remaining in the water. They're applied to the water, they're taken up by the fish or the shrimp or whatever is being cultured, and essentially the remainder and stays in the water. So we do have an accumulation of antibiotics in the water, in the fish, and so with that we are having an important pathway for human exposure. Here's just an example of one study in China that found that 52% of the shrimps from the aquaculture actually had antibiotics. And out of those 52%, 10% had actually very high levels of antimicrobials, exceeding the maximum residue limits that are defined by the Chinese government in this case. So to sum it up, here we have an overview of how antimicrobials are flowing through our food chain. So we have, of course, the use of antimicrobials in humans as well as in animals. They are transferring those through the wastewater, to the feces, into the manure, into the water system, and in the end of the day, they end up in our aquatic environment. And through that, they can enter our food system again through irrigation, through application to the soil, and can then also contaminate farm produce. So we have exposure directly through consumption of animal products, either from livestock or from aquaculture, as well as the potential exposure through farm produce in terms of most significantly foods that are going to be consumed without being cooked, something like lettuce, for example. So to sum it up, some important knowledge gaps do remain. For example, about the environmental fate of antibiotics. How long do they stay in the environment? What's the half-life? How does the half-life change as it drops in soil depth, for example? Or what are the conditions that facilitate the gene transfer? And what are the transmission routes that are most relevant for humans? Where are the critical control points that we need to integrate? How do the microbial environments of soil, water, or the sediments are affected in the long term? What is again, in terms of half-life, in terms of the persistence of these antimicrobials? The extent of antimicrobial resistance and also the distribution of the genes are not well monitored. So we do need to have stronger surveillance systems, and particularly in low middle income countries, we do need to extend the surveillance so we get an understanding where are the antibiotics, and what type of antibiotics are there? And although there are these knowledge gaps, and we don't know exactly, we do already have sufficient evidence to tell us there is a significant problem out there. There is effects on human health, animal health, and also the issues of agricultural productivity, as well as economic consequences. So there is the need to act. And the solution is also quite obvious. We need to adapt more responsible use of antimicrobials across the entire food chain. We need to raise awareness that using antimicrobials in agriculture, in livestock production, in aquaculture, does have consequences for one health, for the health of humans, the health of animals, as well as the health of the environment. So we do need to develop regulations, but more importantly, we need to find ways to enforce and survey the system. And this, in terms of, from a food systems perspective, is something where we need to think about food safety standards, where we need to think about critical control points. So as conclusion, the One Health takes a holistic view. It tries to understand the different angles of the problem, taking into account the human, the animal, and the environmental side. And essentially what we're seeing is that we need this interdisciplinary approach to solve the complex challenge of the 21st century. If we're looking at this antimicrobial resistance, if we simply say we ban all antibiotics in animals, what is the effect going to be? We're going to see a collapse of the livestock sector. The system right now cannot operate like this. So there needs to be a way to adapt the system. And to bring it to the Brazilian example, cattle in Brazil is not a key user of antimicrobials. No, because it's being reared extensively. And this is actually something that should be promoted. Whereas the use of poultry, where everything is kept very confined and it's about maximizing the number of chickens on 1 square meter, there it is actually necessary to have the antibiotics to keep that high productivity. Is that desirable? Is there different ways? Of course, but this is what One Health is about. Looking at the different angles, the economic side, the health side, the behavioral side, the political side, and trying to find solutions that can actually be sustainable. AMR is the quintessential One Health issue. It does require these multiple actors, and as I just said, it's not just about agriculture, but we do need to have actions. We cannot have actions just in one area. We need to combine our efforts. And yeah, so lastly, we have the spread of antimicrobial resistance through our environment, through the food chain. And what we need is surveillance, food safety, awareness building, and knowledge among the consumers, because I think that is actually the biggest power out there, is the consumers. If the consumer is demanding a change of the system, then the industry responds. And lastly, then the promotion of responsible use of antibiotics across all sectors, in humans, animals, and of course also in agriculture. And with that, I thank you very much. I hope I didn't take too much time, and I welcome your questions, and I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Timo. It was an excellent speech. And I just learned a lot of things. You know, I didn't know the concept of One Health initiative. And Christian has already told me something like this, but as he's abroad, I can't chat with him. But it's a big initiative, a multidisciplinary approach, very interesting. And of course, the antibiotic resistance, it's a problem. We are in the pharmaceutical we are in a pharmaceutical science institute, and we know how big is this problem. And for the consumers, if you are a vegan or if you whatever, we are in this chain. Everyone is in this chain. it's really difficult to tackle this problem. And we know that we have lots of, how can I say, the gray and black market, the use of this kind of antibiotics. I work with prebiotics, and we know that pro and prebiotics use could, I don't know if tackle the problem, but could solve a part of this problem. And I have a question, and in your opinion, Timo, from whom would be the responsibility of this huge use of antibiotics, in your opinion, Timo?
I mean, this is a difficult one. I mean, the biggest contributor in terms of use is the agricultural sector. So I do think that this is also the place where it's going to be the best to tackle, to reduce the use. But I think in terms of responsibility, we cannot shift it simply to the farmers themselves. Because I think, I mean, the large scale production, maybe they have the capacities, but we also have to think about this kind of small scale farmers, the smallholders. And for them, it's not going to be very easy to change the way production is being done. And I think it was about 2 years ago, we had a One Health conference here in Bonn, and we had a person here from a big meat manufacturer from the Netherlands. And he was telling us it is not possible to take antibiotics out of livestock production, at least not in the way we are producing right now. So I do think it is a combination. We need to have, of course, the will from farmers to adapt new systems. I think we need the pressure from the consumers, and I think that is where I think we have the best chance of actually sparking something in terms of building awareness among the consumers, so that the consumers are demanding different type of animal production. And this is also very closely linked to ideas of animal welfare, in my opinion, at least. Why do we need so much antibiotics in intensive livestock? Because they are being kept in very confined settings. We're basically overloading these, as I like to call them, factories, factories of meat production. And obviously, that's not going to be healthy for the animal, and it's not healthy for the animal. And why do we have to give them antibiotics so the system works? Because the system itself is not healthy. Who is the person to change this? I think we're not going to get that from the people who are running that system, who are making their money out of that system. For them, it's going to be very difficult to adapt. There needs to be some funding from the governments to help these industries shift, but there's only going to be that pressure when it comes from the consumers. So I think that is where the responsibility lies, and sadly, the responsibility lies with all of us. Now we are the ones who need to demand change, and as scientists, not just as consumers, but as scientists, actually develop some of the evidence to convince politicians, to convince the consumers that we do need change. And I think when we're looking, as I was saying before, the cattle production in Brazil, I think that is something where we can use that as maybe even something like a better practice. Let's have extensive cattle. Let's have higher prices for meat, and with that have better health of the animals, better welfare of the animals, and less use of antibiotics. I know this is a very big long-term vision, maybe not the easy answer that you were hoping for, but I mean, that is my opinion in this regard.
Yeah, I just think the same way. But the thing is that here in Brazil, at least here in Brazil, the consumers, they don't know what are antibiotics, for what they are used for. They think that antibiotics just you use when you are with maybe a cold or infection, but the main production, the main use of antibiotics are in the livestock, not in the humans. You said that. So for us here in Brazil, it's really difficult. No one knows that large-scale antibiotics are used in our livestock. Yeah, thank you, Timo. Christian?
Oh, no, yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with most of the topics that Timo expanded. I just wanted to point one, which is really interesting, that Timo didn't mention, and I was kind of curious how it is here in Germany, actually, and in Europe, I guess, European Union in general. So in Brazil, one of the problems that came to my attention over this last 2 years working on this interface with AMR was the fact that in the milk production industry, I mean, you use it extensively on the perinatal period when the cows actually just gave birth, and before and during and after, and that milk, of course, cannot be used for consumption because the levels of antibiotics that actually come out in the milk is very high. But the milk is not thrown away. The milk is actually used, and it's used to feed the calves. So that antibiotic that's deemed unsafe for actually human consumption is actually very much being used on those animals indirectly, which is one of the things that you said. I mean, the antibiotic's not necessarily being used for promoting the growth, it's being used for preventative and you know, infection treatment, and even on the calves, they do get quite a bit of infection on the first weeks of life. So I was wondering how it is that the politics of the milk on this this wastage milk that's actually during the antibiotic treatment, if you have any data or any information about that in Europe. And I'm curious because, I mean, I consume a huge amount of yogurt here and overall, and there's an abundance of many different types. So I was just curious about if you have any information on that, on those differences and similarities.
Unfortunately, I don't actually know what happens with the waste milk. I mean, it is exactly what, as you said, you know, there is the limits. There is this period after a cow got antibiotic for the next, I think it's like 28 days or something like that. The milk cannot be used for human use. But I actually don't know what happens to that waste milk. Now you spark my curiosity. I'll find out and I will tell you next time we talk.
Sure.
But of course, I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing in terms of antimicrobials that is not so much being considered. It's very much in the food chain, we're looking at the end product. So in the end product, the one that's for human consumption, there is some surveillance here in the context of Germany, mostly in terms of residues of antimicrobials that cannot be exceeded. But the use in the animal itself is, of course, there. And when the animal is excreting the feces, when the animal is giving milk, of course it has the antibiotics. And regardless if the milk is then fed to the calves, which is probably what's being done here in Germany also, this is kind of my feeling. But even if it's not, if it's discarded along with the feces, it doesn't disappear. No, it stays, it's entering our environment. And I think that is the part that is very often not thought about within the kind of food system, surveillance system, the kind of output side of things. How does it actually enter into our environment? And yeah, I think that is an interesting question about the waste milk. I'll find out. I'm sorry, I don't know.
No, that's okay. I was just very curious about it too, because it was novel for me as well. Didn't quite knew about it, and I thought was like, okay then. So that was sparked my curiosity.
Yeah.
I guess.
Christian, there is a question from our colleague Bernadette. So, Timo, I will read the question. Okay.
Yes, please.
She said, interesting talk. One Health became a hot topic. The problem is that antimicrobials remain irreplaceable in animal production unless we are moved to plant-based foods or eliminate animals from the planet, which is obviously impossible. And then comes food insecurity. It would be nice to hear Timo's opinion.
Yes, I mean, this is exactly, yeah. I mean, you're 100% right. This is exactly the challenge, and this is how do we change that? And I think, and I know this is it is something that might be coming very much from this kind of highly developed country perspective. We need to reduce, in my opinion, meat consumption. I'm not advocating for everybody going vegan. I think that is something that is not desirable. But I mean, here in Germany, and we do have a trend towards more vegetarians coming out, but we do have this tendency of eating meat all the time. So for breakfast, there is meat. For lunch, there is meat. For dinner, there is meat. 7 days per week, and basically all year round. When I look to like the generation of my grandparents, it's kind of different. You know, they had meat like once or twice a week, and it was something special. Through the way that our system has evolved, and antimicrobials are an important role of that, we intensified livestock production, we dropped the prices, and with that we made meat accessible to everybody, and that's good. We should have meat accessible for everybody, but we got to a point where meat is so cheap that we eat it all the time. It's nothing special anymore. There's no value in the meat, and I think that would be my take on this. If we reduce the amount of meat consumption by increasing the prices, by de-intensifying agriculture, basically by having more extensive systems, having more value on animal welfare, then we can actually create a system that we have we're still going to use antibiotics in animal production. I mean, that's fine, but we can reduce it, and we can reduce it significantly. And then when we're talking about food security, actually animal products are not the most efficient way. If we're looking at this, and I don't have the exact number in my mind, but I'm sure you heard all about this before. Something like you need 10 kgs of grain to produce 1 kg of beef, right? I'm not sure about that number, that's true, but something along that ratio. So technically, you could feed a lot more people with the amount of grain that it takes to produce 1 kg of beef. So when we're looking at along those lines, then of course we're coming to micronutrient deficiencies and these type of things. It is a complex issue, and I don't have the quick fix solution. But I think if we do go into some direction like that, that we can reduce animal use of antimicrobials, still have animal production, have higher quality meat, more tasty meat in that sense also. The risk, of course, is that we are going to have the price at a point that's so high that some people will not be able to access this, and that is the issue. How we can solve this, I think that is something that's very challenging, and that's why it's great to have economists and agricultural scientists and veterinarians and everybody kind of work together to think about how can that work, and actually working with the practice people as well, the people who are actually doing animal production on their day-to-day basis, probably for generations. The knowledge they have, this is what will help us to create systems that are less antibiotic intensive. I don't have the solution. I just have the way, and that is One Health, of course.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks, Tim. Let me see if there is any other question. There is one. Let me see. There is one question, Timo. She's saying that the extensive creation of the livestock, not confined, but the extension, it's for the well-being of the animal, it's the ideal regarding the zoonosis. However, how to tackle the high cost of this kind of production, the environmental impact, and let me see, and well, the how can I say, the yield of the production.
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah, no, I understand the question, and this is exactly the problem with this. And I think in Brazil, you have a huge country. You have the possibility to actually do extensive agriculture. Here in Germany, it is already much more challenging, just because we don't have as much land available. So even in terms of feasibility, the amount of milk production that we're having in Germany, if we would convert this to extensive agricultural production, it would be impossible. There simply is not enough space available. So it cannot be the complete solution, of course, to transform everything into an extensive system. There needs to be some more confined settings. And I think that is where it's about finding the balance. How many animals can we put together in a, let's call it the factory farm, without creating too much closeness between them? What is the amount of space? And there's like kind of like hybrid models that are possible, where animals have access at least partially to larger grazing grounds. So there would be, I don't know, shifts of animals being able to graze outside. It's difficult, and again, for this, I don't really have the solution. In terms of the cost, and I think that is one of the key concerns when it comes to extensive systems. I think the only way to bear that cost is to accept that high quality meat from extensively produced animals is going to cost more. So the consumer would have to be willing to pay more. I think that would be my my take on that. And then we come to what I was saying before. Then it's not going to be possible for, let's say, an average person to eat a steak every day. But is it necessary to eat a steak every day? Is it healthy to eat a steak every day? Now, coming into some difficult terrain, and I'm sure there's many different opinions about that. No, but if we have higher prices, we might not be able to eat it as commonly. But then on that one day, on that, I don't know, that Sunday where we eat meat, and it is an expensive steak, we are going to value it that much more. And yeah, so that would be my take in terms of environmental impacts. Yeah, this is difficult to manage, and I think that depends very much on the situation also. I think in Brazil, with a large country, it is probably better or easier to manage than in a country like Germany, where things are confined already. Yeah, so I don't have the solution to that.
Yeah, but you gave lots of clue. Yeah, definitely.
I think one of the points is that, and this is why I think One Health actually is an interesting nexus, is because those are not simple questions. Those are not simple issues. They really demand expertise that comes from across fields, you know, not just the interdisciplinary, but transdisciplinary, really, to be able to implement that in practice. Because it's all very nice to be able to think about them and it's like, oh yeah, the solution is simple, put it in extensively, but you know, easier said than done. So, and it requires really that you have the subjects, you know, looked at and addressed from this different points of view. I think that it's one of the things that actually makes perhaps more interesting and more perhaps easier to achieve the goals of what is being proposed is the fact that the whole premise of the One Health is to bring the different players together, as opposed to start individually on their own labs, and then eventually somebody will just collect the information and transform it into policy. And the idea here is that already knowing that you require all that information coming from the different fields so that they can be translated into something that is a solution. So at least for me, this one.
Yeah, that is very true. And that's again kind of One Health is kind of the way to get to the solution. Bring the people together, get the people who are the practice partners, get the policymakers. The most important aspect is to have the will. I think if we have the will, if we understand this is a problem we need to tackle, and we can bring all the people, all the players involved to come together, that then we can find a way. And it's not going to be the perfect solution. I think there is never going, if we take it, let's say, from a strictly public health point of view, or from a strictly pharmaceutical point of view, or from a strictly agricultural point of view, we will not find the perfect solution for that. Because we do have to balance. So we have to accept that the production needs to be a little bit more intensive, and we need to give a little bit more antibiotics into the system. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And that's what the farmer will tell you. On the same time, we cannot go into the maximum condensed system, because that's the health scientists will tell you this doesn't work. And if you go for all of the extensive system, there's an environmentalist and the farmer and whoever is going to tell you it doesn't work. So in the end, it's going to be all of us, all the different disciplines coming together and negotiating essentially what is a possibility. And as I was saying in the talk also, it's a kind of iterative process. So we come together, we discuss, we see, we try. And we evaluate, and then we come back and reevaluate, and maybe we come up with something else. And it's a process, I think, of societal change. And I think One Health is very much about understanding that the solutions need to be built with the practice, with different disciplinary expertise from the bottom up, because we cannot come as scientists, here's a solution, we convince a politician, they make a policy, and with that, all of a sudden, the problem is solved. This will not work. We need to all be together in one boat and decide we move together, and then we can find it. That is really the heart of One Health, working together to solve these complex problems that we cannot solve alone.
Okay, Timo, so we don't have any more questions. So I would like to thank you a lot for this incredible speech. And I will just say a little words in Portuguese. Please. And then I will pass to Christian to end the speech. Então, eu gostaria de agradecer a todo mundo a presença, pessoal. Vocês viram que essa iniciativa do One Health é uma iniciativa multidisciplinar e que nós temos, enfim, diversos profissionais trabalhando e entendendo, enfim, nesse caso, né, que é o que o Timo foi atrás, né, está indo atrás, a parte do food systems, né, então do sistema da produção, distribuição e o consumo do alimento, que está intrinsecamente relacionado ao nosso programa de pós-graduação em Ciência dos Alimentos e também aos outros programas de pós-graduação relacionados ao alimento dentro da USP. So Chris, I'm sending you the word. Timo, thank you one more time. And Christian, could you please make the end of this speech, please?
Sure. Yeah, no, I just would like to thank Timo again. It's been a great overview of the entire history even behind it, which is not necessarily easy to find all the data that you presented, so nicely summarized. And I also reinforce that this is this is an ongoing a partnership between our institutions and the programs, and we are actively seeking out to both receive students from Germany in Brazil and send students from Brazil to Germany as well. So I think that I can see very nice interactions in the future as well, and I hope that everybody else will also benefit from it as well. So with that, thanks everybody for watching the talk, and until next time, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Timo. Hope to see you in Brazil in 2021 or 22, or I don't know when.
Yeah,
but
hopefully soon. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Ana,
man.
thank you. Ana, você pode terminar agora a transmissão, tá? Tá bom, obrigado.